ideas for our further discussion, because we are very interested in the feedback from the Polish audience. What is actually your perception of what happened in Ukraine? What is your attitude? So I would propose for the discussion a couple of important aspects as for us, which are also presented in this issue. First of all, the specificity of the protest, because it can be called like the protest of protests, the protest which provides the possibility to protest in Ukraine in the future. And it refers to the very wide and broad social composition of the protest. Almost all of the classes, except maybe the most rich ones in Ukraine, have participated in the uprising. And it also proves this logic of transformation of the protest, because during its development, Maidan changed its face at least a couple of times. I mean that how it looked like from the very beginning at the end of November last year differs much from how it looked like in December and how it changed in the second part of January and finally in February this year. So it's really important to understand in which way it became possible that a lot of different people, which were altogether not a mass, had the possibility and desire to cooperate all together on one square, and in the square throughout Ukraine. So I would say that we experienced like Ukrainian multitude revolution. The second point that I wanted to emphasize is the political European dimension of the uprising, because being from the very beginning a small, peaceful, pro-European protest, Maidan then transformed into all Ukrainian people's social uprising against state repressive criminal apparatus. In this way, that is the true European dimension of the protest. It's not because, as it was called, Euromaidan. Euromaidan finished on the 1st of December last year. Afterwards, what we saw in Ukraine was just Maidan, not Euromaidan. But it is European Maidan in the sense of Agora, because the basic matrix which was inscribed in the frame of the protest was the conflict between like, the demos and oligarchy. The demos was protesting against oligarchy, trying to constitute, to start real politics. Because what we had before in Ukraine was not a politics, but like a social physiology, which was imposed by our ex-authorities. And the third important, as for me, aspect I would like to propose for the further discussion is the visuality of this revolution. That's why actually this fifth issue consists mostly from the photos. So we decided to build up the visual narrative in the issue, which can cover somehow the logic and the structure of the protest. The visual in general was constantly present during the whole uprising. I would say even that Maidan showed that visual culture is really a political strategy. It was very spectacular, and maybe Maidan was the best picture, the best visual material Ukraine ever produced. And this situation of the revolution was also very fruitful for filmmakers, for movie makers, for documentarists, because the revolution itself was like a fantasy, like a movie already. It was like Duchamp's ready-made for the further screening, for the further showing. So that's why we were trying to be like self-reflective and to analyze Maidan using its own tools, visual means, for better understanding. And as for the visual narrative which is present in the issue, I am passing the microphone to my colleague Oksana Briukhowecka, who was the visual editor of this issue.
Hello. If you look through the magazine, you could follow my story in pictures. Its visual part mostly consists of a series of photographs by different photographers, which represent different sides of the event, as Maidan was a very multidimensional phenomenon. Photo series begins with some pictures made by architect Alexander Bolakov, who explores the transformation of the city space, which happened during the protests. Barricades become one of the most impressive and recognizable images of Maidan. At first, they were made from improvised materials, benches, fences, branches of artificial Christmas tree, and later supplemented with protest building materials, tires, wood boards, wires. When there were a lot of snow in January, people put it into sacks to build the highest barricades at Institutska and Grushevskoye streets. Paving stones from under their feet used as weapon. Smoke screen from burning tires had the function of protective wall against the police attacks. So Maidan transformed the space around all the time according to the needs of the struggle. The next series of pictures illustrates different participants of the events according to their ideological colors. Widely discussed that far-right groups were very active from the beginning of the protests, including the right-wing party Svoboda. They produced slogans, fomented patriotic feelings, from time to time making attacks on leftist activists who also stealth. However, the situation actually became the mirror of the Ukrainian society of the last years. Thus, Maidan became a small model of all conflicts were built in the street confrontation. The Ukrainian society, despite its protest potential, could not at once produce emancipatory agenda, much as the leftists would like. Instead, they sang carols, prayers, and the anthem of Ukraine. But Maidan had a dream, a utopia of Europe, which symbolized quality of life, the abidance of human rights, and break up with criminal outrage of the regime at power. In this context, it's also important to represent the so-called Titushki, people who were brought from the east of Ukraine for confronting Maidan in Kyiv. People from different parts of Ukraine being set on each other. We have witnessed this since the Orange Revolution through Maidan until the war events they are going on at East right now. It is crucial that at Maidan there was standing a lot of different people who didn't identify themselves as right or left wing. The theme which united people was the hate towards the authorities, which during the events showed itself as the monster, the true enemy of the community. Each time the authorities tried to disperse, clean up Maidan, more and more people came and stayed. Still later on, at the back of the mainstream stage of Maidan, an alternative stage of the Free University appeared with its educational program, organizing lectures, film screenings, talks by journalists and artists. Then also in the building of the Ukrainian House, which at some point became the cultural and educational center of Maidan, left-wing student organization managed to launch their initiatives. In the end, the Ministry of Education was occupied by leftist students, and the Ministry of Culture was occupied by grassroots and art initiatives. The premises were held for several weeks, providing space for meetings, of initiative groups discussing the demands to put forward and how to reorganize the power structures. The next series illustrates how solidarity initiatives and personal contributions arranged the everyday life of Maidan, where anyone could have some food and tea, medical help, warm clothes for free. Another series shows the face of armed confrontation with the police. Hundreds of people who never use weapons took improvised shields and threw Molotov cocktails and paving stones. Activists organized the hospital guard, watching the hospitals day and night, providing the injured people with the medication, food, clothes, and above all gathering information about them, so that they wouldn't disappear in the police department, which helped chase away the fear and impeded lawlessness. At that time, many people were scared. Nevertheless, when one went to Maidan, the fears moved away. Many people intentionally came there for the night because of the threat of police cleanup operation. When speaking about the victims, people who died at Maidan were regular people who died occasionally. However, the ethics of Maidan was considering the value of each life and each death as a tragedy. This is the difference between the situation of Maidan and the nowadays war in Ukraine. After the shooting of February, the trade union house set on fire. Maidan became a burned area of ashes, the big social injury. So the image of the burned Maidan seems very important, which is why it is on the cover, representing the hell that people have come through. It was also embodied in the mass public mourning ceremonies over the victims of Maidan. Maidan shouted, "Heroes don't die, but one becomes a hero after death. And the death of each person is not heroism, it's a disaster, and we should remember about this in the first place when we think about war now." Thank you, and I will give microphone to Lesia.
Good evening. So I guess it is important in our meeting to somehow stress probably the meaning of the Maidan and the lessons that we can have from this event. And in this context, Wasyl in his speech told that Maidan was a kind of confrontation between demos and oligarchy, the crucial quality of this, the crucial trait of this movement. And of course it was like that, but as we know, that one of the consequences of Maidan was actually the president elections, when the Petro Poroshenko, the current president of Ukraine, were elected, and it is widely known that he is also an oligarch. And this actually leads to the widespread vision that this event was actually the main result of this event was the shift of political elites, as usual, and that people were manipulated and used to just like some political elites just used this movement to take power. And I think that this kind of vision is true somehow, but from the other point, it's like misleading and really dangerous because it kind of paralyzes the further potential of this grassroots movement. It's paralyzing people initiative for political action. But what I was going to stress about Maidan that actually, so what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the kind of disappointment, yeah, that probably came after Maidan. And here we should remember that we already had this Orange Revolution, and also this kind of disappointment that that was also the result of this Orange Revolution, which also led to the shifts of elites and who gave no results for positive results for the people's life. And for me, one of the very important and heroic things of the Maidan that this kind of disappointment was a kind of context in which this Maidan movement emerged. So I'm talking about the vision of the understanding of politics that dominated in Ukrainian society at the moment when Maidan started. That it was vision of a political sphere as a kind of remote and distanced from the people sphere, where some powerful elites making some decisions which influences our life, but it's a kind of a sphere where some powerful subjects acted, and we, like the ordinary people, don't have any access to this political sphere. And actually, this feeling of the weakness was very strong when the Maidan emerged, and it was very widespread, these different conspiracy theories that despite we come here to this square and we want to intervene somehow to this political process, but we don't have actually any skills and we don't have any instruments and we don't know how to actually to get access to this sphere where the really important decisions are taken. And it was a kind of feeling of weakness and uncertainty in the people's ability to actually influence. Like this mood, this vision dominated Ukrainian society probably the whole period of Ukrainian independence. And well, you know that this kind of understanding of politics is a special sphere which are only some exclusive subjects has access to. It leads to the feeling of impotence and leads people to somehow to, people who understand politics as something which is close to them, so they prefer to organize their private lives, to manage their private business, and it leads to atomization of society and collapse of public and political sphere. But what is a miracle of Maidan for me? That despite of this mood, of this feeling of weakness, of this absence of skills and instruments, and clear vision or clear strategy, how to influence, how to intervene to this political sphere, people still made this decision to act politically. Like a lot of people who came to Maidan, when they were asked by journalists, how you see the probable results of this movement, how you think you can influence, they told that I don't know actually how can I influence, how can I make real changes in the country, in political situation, but still I just have this feeling that they have this strong will to political action. And as you probably know, this very famous thing about Maidan, this self-organization. So when people came to Maidan and they didn't know actually, and of course it was a feeling that you fight with the forces that's much more stronger than you, because from the one side is people, and from the other, people who doesn't have any experience of political action and any skills, and from the other side is the power, is the state, which with a strong military apparatus and so on. And it was like this very strong feeling of the inequality of the forces. And one of the reactions to this feeling of uncertainty and of weakness was that people just came here and involved in a collective labor. So I think it is really symptomatic for Ukrainian situation that the only way of political activity that were accessible to people was to involve in collective labor. People came to Maidan and they wanted to engage in some process, and what they did, they just started to prepare food or organizing this space, building barricades. So if people came there, wanted to engage, and they didn't know what to do else except of involving some physical labor process. And this probably from some point of view it looks like absolutely inappropriate probably tools, yeah, to cause some real political changes. But the miracle happened when I think that from this collective labor process, when people engaged not in private, when people started to develop this collective deeds, yeah, collective process, from what emerged in this process is exactly the public sphere and the sphere of it. I mean, in this labor process, we burn a kind of political practice. So this, in this process, we burn a collective political subject. And what is important, then, of course, the Maidan ended, and then was this election and the shift of police and so on. But one of the important consequences is that during this participation in this collective labor, yeah, this common action, it gave people an empowerment and a strong will to proceed in this common political activity. And what emerged after Maidan is a whole range of grassroots initiatives. Out of Maidan emerged a lot of people. When Maidan finished, people started to organize people council. This was trying to develop and to invent some different forms of, so to say, different instruments how to influence the state policy. Because you know that the only form of political action, of political participation in Ukraine was the parties. But Maidan, out of Maidan, Maidan wanted initiatives for different, will to invent different kinds of political, different political tools. So, for example, as Oksana said, that people occupied the Ministry of Culture and organized a council which were aimed to influence policy of this culture ministry, and the same was going on in the Ministry of Education, and the whole range of different grassroots initiatives branched from the Maidan. The problem is that, of course, the war started, and all these processes of democratization and politicization of Ukrainian society were suspended because of the war. And actually, that's the very, like you said, point. But I still hope that we cannot say that it is diminished, but suspended, and this process will develop further in the future.
Thank you. I would also like to speak about another dimension, maybe, of Maidan, which hasn't been yet elaborated by my friends, because besides it being some specific social phenomenon or, of course, media phenomenon, Maidan is also an actual square in the center of the city of Kyiv. And the way it looks like, I find very important and interesting, because this outlook is the result of the reconstruction which started in the year 2011 as a strategy to prevent people from protesting against the regime of the former President Leonid Kuchma. And the result of the reconstruction was a square really inconvenient for the public gatherings of any kind. It's either political or even recreational, because they built this huge shopping mall under the square. It was the underground shopping mall, and actually the first trade center of this kind in Ukraine, and it was owned by the oligarchs and the gangsters from the 90s. And on the square itself there appeared this Gichi monument of independence, which was supposed to be a symbol of Ukraine itself as a state, and it had a certain ideological function. And but ironically, by its own this ridiculous outlook, this space started maybe to provide a certain Marxist critique of the social relations of Ukrainian society, because it looked like the base and the superstructure, in which the base was, of course, the consumers' capitalism and the ideology of which represented the nationalistic turn of the ideology. And maybe that is why throughout the 2000s Maidan still continuously remained the place for the protest, for the mass protest activities of any kind. And in November 2013, when there was the first brutal, violent police attack on the protesters, they came back in a day and stayed there for almost 9 months until they were expelled a couple of weeks ago before the celebration of the Independence Day. And so Maidan 2013-2014 was actually probably the most long-lasting protest in Ukraine, and in this sense we can talk about Maidan not only as a fight for democracy or some basic human rights, but also as a fight for a public space. And especially considering the fact that after the protest events finished, there started the discussion about how Maidan should look like after. So maybe in some time there will follow another reconstruction of the square as a result of this revolution. And so maybe not only this revolution produced a certain way of conducting politics, but a new physical space. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statements. I will invite Oleksij Radynski to speak a little bit later. Okay, so I will start the discussion with 3 questions, then I would ask others whether they already have some comments and questions. You spoke a lot of very interesting issues that might be taken out of your interventions and elaborated furthermore. Which caught my attention really a lot was something which Oksana called small model of the society, and this is what I would like to start from. As far as I understood, you said there was this very special momentum inside the process of revolution that took place in Maidan, but a kind of very special democratic or emancipatory kind of small society appeared that sustained afterwards, as Lesia mentioned, or even developed. But in general, it was somehow covered by the forthcoming events, the annexion of Crimea and the war now. But still, I would like to stop for a moment on this question about small model of the society. If you could try to characterize it a little bit further, what kind of values did this model of society follow? What kind of interpersonal practices? What, in a concrete way, did it mean to you? Why do you think that there was this special model of society?
When I said this, I mean that that Ukrainian society now until Maidan is in general a very conservative and patriarchal society, and different forms of this. We also watched at Maidan. For example, like I told, singing the songs, carols, and etc. And at one point, when we look at this and hear this, we cannot see other things. And these other things think what was that this society has a big potential, but it cannot find the forms how to realize it till now. For example, the anthem of Ukraine. What does it mean that it started to be the anthem of Maidan in a way? I think it also was an intention of people to take power, and because the anthem it's a symbol of power, and people wanted to take it in their hands. But the different conflicts between right-wing groups and leftists, I thought about this because in Maidan we can see all this struggle which was been during last years in our society. So that's why.
So you said that you said about model of society, so as I understand. Am I right? It was your formulation. It was a kind of model of society.
This is what.
Yeah. So I will probably make some correction to this definition, because it was not probably. Yeah. In some cases, it was a model of society because it mirrored the some conflicts and some forces and so on, some social groups. But from the other perspective, it was not a model of society, but probably an exception, a kind of, I don't know, a utopian space, something which is unprecedented for Ukraine, because as I was trying to talk about in my short speech, Ukrainian society was quite atomized, where this political sphere were expropriated from people, and for Ukrainian society it was quite usual for people to take care about themselves. Like everyone was busy with their own business, organizing private lives and private, some private happiness or something. And what was unprecedented in Maidan, that there emerged this collective body based on an altruistic approach. So first, for the long period of history, of Ukrainian people engaged in some, on the altruistic basis, in some common process, in some common deeds. And they were taking care not about themselves and their families and their private interests, but they were engaged in some process which concerned so that was the birth of the real public sphere, where everyone take part and participate in some collective political process. So that was one of the very important points about Maidan, and it is important, and it seems to me that this experience of participation, of involvement, of engagement in some collective altruistic practice, that was really, like for everyone who was involved in this Maidan activity, it was really precious feeling of this power to influence some big processes, not about your own life, but about the life of the whole society. And this experience that people were really want to preserve and to develop. And that's why I think that Maidan gives this very strong energy and empowers people to gave them enthusiasm to proceed in these collective, collaborative activities, and that is very important. But of course, then the situation of war a little bit changed the trajectory of this. Energy probably, and now a lot of people who are empowered by this feeling of collaboration in Maidan feel that they feel that the way how they can realize this need for collective collaboration, collective political activity is to engage, to take part in the war, to take a look and go to war. And a lot of people who participated in Maidan did do so.
Yeah, just a couple of things to elaborate this idea. I would really agree with the term model, because of course it was the exception from the social life of Ukraine, because Maidan is the political mean. It cannot be conducted on an everyday basis forever, because as an action, to put it generally altogether, what happened on Maidan, it's like an atomic bomb of the civic society. The society cannot live usually on an everyday basis like that, because it's like state of exception, like during Marshall's law. But still, it is the model in the sense that the idea and the community that emerged on the central squares, first of all in Kiev and other cities of Ukraine, were somehow mirroring the structure, the model of the Ukrainian state itself. And this aspect differentiates the uprising of Maidan from other political and social movements when we have a look from the global scale, because the main idea was to build up an infrastructure. It was like a small city, small state inside the state, and it gives like another proof for this comparison between with the ancient Greek history, ancient Greek democracy, because it can be perceived like polis. So it has everything it has. It is inscribed in it, in the frame of it, because it had its own food supply, its own popular culture, its own education, its own army, so-called the self-defense of Maidan, and so on and so on. Like its own TV. All of the social basic needs that the state usually has were present on the central square. So from this point of view, I would say that it was like a true biopolitical protest, in the sense that usually the production of goods, which is made by society, is taken from it by some elites for their own benefit. Yeah. But anyway, it's us. It is we who produce life. Yeah. It's we producing everything around us. And in the process of Maidan, this production of life was redirected from the side of elites onto the society itself. And this is important to understand when we are putting, trying to map Maidan on the global, in the global context.
And, for example, it was one idea about how to organize, for example, food for all people in Maidan. You can hear there that it must do women, and men, they must take a weapon and struggle. But in real life, often women also were in the main hot places and helped like medicines. And but this record that women are just for preparing food and men for struggle, they must be someone who said that it's not this way. And some feminists tried to do that. They went to Maidan and started to tell to these people about this. And often people will agree that yes, we are all together do this. But some right-wing groups can attack the feminists, and these discussions, like in society, they happen directly in the square often.
Oksana also used an expression, Maidan had utopia of Europe. I would like to ask you what kind of imaginary Europe you recognized within the Ukrainian society in the moment of Maidan, or close to the moment of Maidan. I am asking because it also has a lot to do with mirroring. So, yeah, what kind of utopia of Europe, what imaginary of Europe had Maidan?
Europe, it was just like some symbol, maybe, because its protest start from this not writing agreement with Yanukovych didn't write with European Union, and it was like starting of Maidan. And but what people mean when they standing for Europe, it's just something like better life, like in Europe. It's maybe very naive and not realistic hopes, but it was like some way which will help them to make the future of their children better.
I think actually this probably a utopia of Europe was this in general this idea of Europe was important probably at the beginning of the Maidan, and I guess the agenda changed a lot. But actually, I think that the main feature of this Euro utopia for people was like its idea of justice and legislative rules, because in Ukraine, previous history was like a history of wild capitalism, where no rules are valid and where elites can do anything they want. And for people, probably Europe was a kind of embodiment of this rule of justice and these legal procedures. I mean, this legal issue was very important.
Well, yes, I agree in a certain way with Lesia, and probably I would add that this utopia of social justice in which Maidan believed actually maybe in a certain way contradicts the real politics of Europe, because in reality, actually the European Union is dominated by the financial institutions, and maybe that's why this utopia hasn't been understood by the officials of the EU. And being very cynical, they didn't just give a real support to the protesters of Maidan.
Yeah, I would just add that it was really funny to observe during Maidan its perception from the West, because usually typical Western media discourse presented Maidan as the Ukrainian people are fighting for the EU values, which is of course absolutely weird perspective. I would even say perversive perspective. The tricky moment here is that the word euro was and still is very popular in Ukraine. Usually it meant like a prefix, was a synonym to everything which was associated with pleasant, nice, good. For example, usually in Ukrainian, when we want to make like a new renovation inside, we say Euro renovation. So we have Euro windows, Euro shops, so everything which is like modern, contemporary, cool, and up to date, like fashionable. And the event of Maidan transformed this idea. Maybe this confusion comes from the way in which the flag of the EU was used by the protesters, because usually, as you know from being from the EU inside, the protesters in the European countries usually burned the EU flag during the protests. And in Ukraine, the idea of Euro and it became like a revolutionary flag. So in this sense, I would say that Ukrainian protesters dragged Europe to its roots. That's why it was so challenging and even dangerous for the European ruling elites, because basic, as continuing the idea that Justyna expressed, that the basic intention of the Maidan uprising was somehow the idea of a different Europe, which is not existing now. So, which contradicts totally to the EU politics, also towards Ukraine. So that's why Maidan somehow showed that Ukraine demands Europe which is based not on exclusion, meaning also Ukrainians, but the Europe which will be based on inclusiveness, which will demolish the Schengen wall, which is still existing and based on the rules which are working against the people from not inside. The Europe without walls, because anyway, still we can say that somehow the EU, as it looks like now, is a betrayal of the, by the way, revolutions of the '89, because the main demand of the revolutions in the Eastern Europe at the end, before the USSR crashed, was to overcome the division of Europe, which was historical, and the EU, one of the aims, as it was like supposed to be proclaimed, was to overcome this historical division of Europe, and especially to overcome the political isolation of the Eastern Europe. You can still can feel it here. So this idea, it was like a continuation of the same task. So actually, in both moments on which the EU is based, the first one is the main idea of the EU is to stop the war, and the second one is to overcome the isolation of the Eastern Europe. On both moments today, Europe is not present. So the EU is not present in the space in which it is like very much needed. It should be like to accomplish this task, and it's not ready for that.
Thank you very much. It's a good moment also to ask about the possible contribution from your side. There may be already some questions or comments. Być może to jest dobry moment, żeby zapytać Państwa, czy nie mają jakichś komentarzy lub pytań już w tej chwili. Jeśli nie, if not, maybe before we continue the conversation, what do you think about presentation of the movie? Yes. Okay. So I'm very happy to invite you to see the parts of work by Oleksij Radynski with collaboration of Thomas Alva. Oleksij, if you could just tell us what are we going to see, in which moment of the process work on integration, as the title of the piece, and what are we going to see?
Thank you. I'm afraid that I have to disappoint those of you who read the announcement of this event, because somehow mistakenly it was announced as a premiere screening of the film. The idea actually is to make kind of a laboratory kind of test screening of certain fragments of the film that I somehow find relevant and important in the context of our attempt to explain what actually happened and what happened at Maidan and what it led to, what kind of social transformation it encouraged, and the history behind this documentary is kind of attempt of sociological or anthropological research that me and my colleagues were trying to undertake like almost from the very beginning of the protests. So when we started, I suggested the cameraman and my colleagues to treat the events that we see from some kind of distance, although we were in a way participants and in a way supporters of these events, and to try to look at this as actually as a kind of a social model, and to kind of boldly research what is going on in this square, where people are gathered and where people kind of create their own society, which is opposed to the government, which is opposed in a way to the repressive machine of the state, and so on. And this was a completely open-ended approach, so we actually had no real plan and didn't know what it would lead us to. And in some weeks, it turned out that the process we were observing went in a really, really unexpected and interesting dimension. So I think most of the people here know that the main change in the course of Maidan revolution was the resort to the violence. At some point, the non-violent phase of the protest ended for good. It led to the violence on the both sides that was part of the escalation, and in a way we started to see that what we are observing is a very strange process of integration or internalization of the violence, internalization of the repressive machine that is cracking down on the people. People, of course, have to respond to this. People resist, and in a way there is kind of merging of these two opposing societies or social models. So I will suggest to screen 3 short parts of the film. I will comment very shortly on each of them, and generally I suggest to focus on those parts of this material that actually show this process of, put it very simply, people taking the power. How does it happen? What does it mean? And how does it look on the surface, on the level of a public manifestation of political desire of the people, on public manifestation of demands of the people, I am very much looking forward to any kind of feedback, because this is still a work in progress, and it would be really great to know what your impressions will be. I think we have to leave.
The film is in Ukrainian, of course, with English subtitles, so I hope most of us can easily follow, and let us please turn on the lights.
Some parts of this material was produced and published online as genuine opinions, so those of you who are readers of it probably saw some of the things we're going to watch, and the first fragment is devoted to actually the formulation of the demands of the people who are protesting.
Правильно, правильно. За Кремль мы ехали сразу, не до конца.
Должен народ взять власть, когда мы отсюда уйдем, когда простой народ будет управлять страной, а не вот эти богатые, зажженные люди. Каждому надоело терпеть бандитство, как они там в роскоши живут, а мы мучаемся на зарплату 1200 и кормим семью на эти 1200, человек снимает. Жизнь плохая, потому что власть плохая. У меня плохое детство было из-за власти.
Хочется цей беспредел нарешті закінчити, щоб люди жили всі рівно, навчання безкоштовне і так далі. Не було, що крадуть, страдають, інші люди працюють зубами, нічого не мають, а дехто з людей нічого не робить і має гроші за цих людей, їхні робити.
Розуміємо, що в нас сьогодні свої герої, бандити і комуністи. Люди, які не люблять Україну, не люблять українців, і все, що зв'язано з Україною, і не чуже.
Зрадь!
учасниками цих дій, військових дій, навіть якщо будуть стріляти або вибухати будуть, я прийшов за законом. Більшість не знає, що чому вони не працюють.
Вот с Майдана был предупрежден, ему говорили, Янукович, вот одна пуля будет выпущена, вторая пуля летит в тебя. Вот пуля уже набирает скорость. Господь зовет, и зло надо убирать с лица земли, чтобы оно здесь и не вылазило.
I suggest to skip to the moment where the people, the protesters, kind of gained the subjectivity, the political subjectivity of Maidan, and to introduce very briefly the scene. We skip to the moment when, after the massacre on the 21st of February, the opposition leaders and the president kind of arranged an agreement which was supposed to lead to pre-elections, but according to this agreement, the president was supposed to stay for another several months in power, and this is the moment where the opposition leaders were supposed to present this agreement to the public at Maidan, and of course this agreement was immediately broken by the will of the protesters. So this, in a way, was the moment when this event actually became a revolution in the literal sense.
Слава Україні! Слава Україні! Вчора пішло з життя 16 роботівців! І ми нині всі тут! І не час нам створитися! А треба бути пліч-опліч, сумуючи за наших героїв в боротьбі проти цього режиму. І я переконаний, що тепер наша єдність допоможе нам перемогти цю банду, яка стільки зробила зла для України. Вічна пам'ять усім героям! Шановна громада, принесли ще одного з героїв.
Люди добрі, не будьте кимось підпорені. Це тепер не можна кричати сьогодні росіянці. Чому ви так робите? Даємо дві матері. Я коли відкрутили руку, то лише пару днів кричали проти його. Але говорити ганьба, люди добрі, лідерам, українцям не можна так. Ми українці. Вчора кричала Оксана, а сьогодні ганьба. Опам'ятайтеся, хай Господь буде поперед нас. Слава Україні!
And now a fragment that kind of represents the taking over of the power by the people. The last one.
Пока нам боїться тільних.
Слава Україні, слава справжнім героям зараз проходить відомо брати і контроль.
Ми зараз пробираємо план України. Зараз, коли ми помимо їхні машини, вони нас побіжуться і не буде кому голосувати. Ми не чекаємо їхніх депутатів. Вони голосують і допомагають нам. Ці хвилини поміняють владу в Україні. Зараз ми позначимо свого міністра за 5 хвилин. Приймається така пропозиція. Приймається така пропозиція. Оголошується перерва до 16 години. Дякую. Давайте почнемо. Будь ласка.
That's it for now.
Thank you very much for the screening. Once again, we start with addressing the question to you, whether there are any questions or comments. Zacznę od powiedzenia do Państwa, czy są jakieś pytania i komentarze. Oczywiście serdecznie proszę odpowiadać w języku polskim, jeżeli ktoś woli. Ja postaram się tutaj przetłumaczyć dla naszych gości z Ukrainy. Proszę odpowiedzieć.
Thank you very much for coming. That was a wonderful film. And my name is Chris O'Neill, and thank you very much for coming. It was a wonderful film. I hope I could see the entire film at one point. But as you know, that revolutions often are not successful quite often. It's like a pendulum, and the establishment comes back. Or there's a political revolution sometimes, which is also not very good. And my question to you is, not only in consideration of what's happening now in the East, what happened to Crimea, but also in consideration of the strength of the establishment. Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful that Ukraine will become a country of law and economic opportunity?
You have the microphone to that to reply.
To answer shortly to your question, yes, but of course I think it's just a long-term process. So I don't think that everyone I don't think that people waiting for a miracle that we made Maidan and then we'll live in prosperity and everything will change in a moment. Of course not, but it's still very important process initiated. People felt this. They felt that they can. If we were talking about this model of society, so if in this small space, this model of society which were created at Maidan, people felt this power to make a decision, to rule their life at least in this small scale. And this experience is really powerful. So people not gonna lose it. So if you have this experience of ruling this small space, you want to proceed and you want to develop it to the further scale. And all these processes that started after Maidan, these councils that people organized, different initiatives, different conferences, discussions, and so on. Like, we see how the public sphere is developing. And I hope that, of course, it won't be easy and it won't be soon, but I hope that some seeds are now in the ground of Ukrainian society and it will proceed.
You referred to the history of revolutions, and they often don't end up the way it's expected. And I think that we should, when we speak about revolution, we should, in the first place, also speak about counter-revolution. Because counter-revolution usually comes after, and what eclipses the revolution itself, of course. And I think that what we are having now is a classical case of counter-revolution that will for sure eclipse the event that brought it to life. And if you look at history, for example, we can imagine the extent the counter-revolution may take. For example, we can look at the whole history of Soviet Union as a kind of counter-revolution, actually. The Stalinist counter-revolution and post-Stalinist counter-revolution to the event of the October. Yeah. So this is also one of the reasons why we decided actually now, although the war in Ukraine is such a burning topic, to actually go back to rewind kind of history and look actually at the event of Maidan more closely, and to devote this publication actually to this event, because of course it gets erased by the flow of events that it led to, but the origin and the initial event remains a bit actually obscure, unreflected, and so on. So at the moment, the idea was actually to stick to revolution, because the counter-revolution is still, I think, ahead. Its real scale is still unknown.
And I will also add that I would be careful with, more careful with naming Maidan unsuccessful, because, for example, Lesia mentioned that after Maidan there was just a shift of elites, especially after the elections results. But I wouldn't call these elections also the result of Maidan itself, because they were actually happening already during the counter-revolution, after what happened after Maidan, after the annexation of Crimea and the start of the conflict in the east. So I wouldn't call this a shift of elites as the direct result of Maidan, but as a result of the situation which happened after it. So basically, people were voting already in the unofficial state of emergency. That's how it turned out.
Yeah, for sure, we are somehow experiencing counter-revolution which has started long before, even during Maidan. It's not by occasion that we had so-called anti-Maidan. It's like counter-Maidan, which emerged on a paid criminal basis, actually in the region, mostly in the region in which we have a war. But you see, I would also correct your perspective, because your lenses, your glasses you are looking through are like I would call it like technical perspective, because you see when I understand this vision, it's from outside, and it's like we are all waiting for the accomplishments of the possible results of the Ukrainian revolution that can happen still. And of course, it's a big challenge, even if we not take into consideration that it's a big challenge somehow to create circumstances, to work on these circumstances in which we can institutionalize the possible consequences and results of the revolution. It would be a challenge for the Ukrainian elites anyway. But still, I can call it technical, like technocratic perspective, because to understand really like, what is happening in Ukraine now or during Maidan, you should somehow avoid only media representation of the events, because even in case when it's true, when it fits all the facts, still there are a lot of dimensions, a lot of social background which is not present anyway. So we will deal anyway with some anamorphosis which is produced by media because you know, in today's situation when the whole Ukrainian budget of the state is working for war, when all the money, almost all of the money that are coming from IMF are also going for war, when the whole life is because of war, I would propose to look at Ukraine from some anthropological perspective. Maybe from the political point of view, it would be much more appropriate and precise vision. You know, it's just imagine how it sounds for people that are burying their citizens every day. You know, when you have a constant funeral for months, and the other hand, of course, we still need like a lawful country and justice. But the unjust situation is on a very ground level. It's like, you know, what was called after the 9/11 ground zero. Somehow it is how Donbas region looks like now. Because Lugansk is almost not existing. Donetsk is. We don't know the future of this region. So yes, of course, hopefully it will happen. But still, we are dealing with the nightmare somehow.
Any more questions, comments? No?
Będzie po polsku. Ostatnie zdanie przed filmem brzmiało, że Majdan nie spotkał się z żadnym rodzajem, z żadną pomocą, z żadnym aktem solidarności z zewnątrz. I mam do Was pytanie nie od Państwa, tylko od zwykłych ludzi, którzy chcieliby być solidarni, którzy chcieliby być jakąś częścią tego procesu, który się u Was dzieje. Jak sobie wyobrażacie, jak mogłaby wyglądać nasza pomoc, pomoc zwykłych ludzi z Polski, z Europy, pomoc dla Ukrainy? Nie, tylko ja.
Yes, something.
Yes, this is a very nice question, a question that we hear really often, and unfortunately this is the question that I always have a problem answering, but although because of the fact that I'm asked it so often, I already kind of invented maybe the kind of answer. Of course, there's lots of things you can do. There's lots of things people do also in the West, from any kind of, from all kinds of humanitarian help to, I don't know, actual political participation or attempts in the political participation in the so-called Eastern politics. But I think that on a much more basic and important level, what each of us can do, or what each of you can do, the ones who are interested or willing to help, is actually understanding. Because of course, it's commonplace to say that there is a great deal of misunderstanding related to Maidan revolution, to Ukraine generally. There is even much bigger deal of misunderstanding concerning the war now, because it's actually a Russian invasion combined with a civil war. So it's understandable for us that this is a mess, and it looks like a mess, and people don't really understand what's going on. So unfortunately, it's a bad taste now to quote Zizek, but right now it's maybe a good point that he started to repeat recently, that maybe it's enough efforts to change the world. Maybe now it's time to start explaining it. So at some point I think that now it's actually a time, you had a lot of changing, had a lot of all kinds of change happened recently, but now maybe it's time to stop a little bit and start understanding, explaining it, reflecting on it, and so on.
Just to put a comment, does it mean that, for example, as far as I understand, this meeting is an opportunity to provide explanations or some kind of understanding. Could you please, in this particular occasion, express 5 or 6, maybe 2 basic things people from the West, people from whatever, should, let's say, understand from the Maidan and Ukrainian experience? And I could give an example, because what I understand from our discussion is already, or from what we are working on together since some time, is already. Please remember that the most important thing about the recent events in Ukraine was the Maidan itself. This is the first lesson I somehow learned. Of course, I am more passionate about the war in the East now, but after what I should focus on is the phenomenon of Maidan itself. This is one of the key points. Are there any more?
And the way I want to revert it is that I can give in one sentence the as presented by the counter-revolution, actually, let's say by Russia, by the Ukraine. So in one sentence, and this explains actually why there is war, why they went as far as provoking the war. And this sentence goes like this: if you have a protest, a civil dissent, revolution, like a civic movement that aims at toppling the government, this automatically leads to civil war. This is the narrative that Russia is trying to build quite successfully, because it actually does this. This is actually a narration that also is not unique. You know that from the Middle East and from the aftermath of the Arab Spring, for example, in Syria and other places. So this is a narration that kind of hegemonic discourse of the counter-revolution is trying to insert in our minds, and we have to find effective ways to deny it. Because, of course, no one of us should be persuaded or giving to this illusion that if you have this kind of civic dissent, it means war. Of course not.
Well, I would add maybe just a little bit updating the things, because as for Maidan, of course, it's important to underline its constituency and political dimension, but more or less, maybe with some aspects, it was quite clear for general public, because it wasn't so much complicated as the process that started after Maidan. And for today, I think that the most important task it's not even the question only for political elites, but also for ordinary citizens, is to understand not Putin, but the logic in which Russia is proceeding, is functioning today. Because you see, we are dealing with a very tricky ideology, which is basically following the terroristic models. It's not by occasion that Russian propaganda, it's a soft way to call it, is based and constantly using the notion, as in Russian it is called соотечественники. It's like in English, it would be like co-fatherlanders. Yeah. So it's really a very important thing, because we can compare. We had a lot of times that Putin is compared with Hitler. It's of course not so easy. It would be much more easy if it was like that, but of course it's not. And it's not a new loop of the Cold War. We are dealing with totally different new situation, which opens the door to an absolutely new world, which we don't know yet. But the most important thing for me is that Russia somehow is answering to the idea of the human rights, which is the ideology of the West. The West is famous for proclaiming, also in a military way, of the human rights, imposing this principle on every country in the world. And Russia has its own answer. And if the human rights idea is a universal idea, Russian ideology is anti-universal idea. Because the idea of co-fatherlanders means that it's really, they are using like the modus of this Nazi idea of, it's in German called Blutboden. Yeah, it's like ground and blood. So what, for this ideology, because they are presented that they are defending Russians, but Russians in, not like those who are the citizens of Russia. It's not about Россияне. It's not the citizens of Russia, but Русские. And who are those Russians? It's those people who live in other countries. They speak Russian. They think Russian. They are mentally Russian, and they have like Russian soul. And their land they are living in is a Russian land. So, and now, like Russia pretends to own all these territories because it's Russian, and that's why it's so often called in Russian media that they are fighting fascists. Why fascists? Because we are still dealing with the same discourse that lasted from the Second World War, which is in Russia and in the Soviet Union was called Great Patriotic War. It's a Stalinist, and actually this is the only myth that overlived the crash of the Soviet Union. And now it serves as the basis for new Russian ideology. It indicates that Russia and Russian ideology is pretty weak, but still it can be very successful. So it's the same vocabulary. They are taken from the 20th century, but they are putting together this vocabulary from the pre-Soviet era. And this kind of fusion of the Stalinist constructions with the constructions that are taken from the Russian Empire, they really are serving today for all these movements that were imposed by the Kremlin in other countries. Transnistria, Eastern Ukraine, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and so on.
Would you like to?
Probably, I would add, but in completely different perspective than Wasyl said, not about this geopolitical things and ideological. I mean, even not. Well, if your question was about what like West should know or should take into account, so probably I would switch a little bit in optics and talk about different things. That like Western world is a very important. This ideology of efficiency, of forecasting of possible results. So like that any action should be based on the forecast and prognosis and calculations of possible like results, benefits or losses, and that's why I often hear the questions about Maidan, was it worth this or something like that. But for me, the very important like point about Maidan, some like miraculous point that it was an action made in front of complete uncertainty, of complete like uncertainty of your own abilities, of your own forces to do real changes. So people encouraged to do this in front of a lack of any lack of any certainty of possible success of this action. So that's like really for me it's like a very heroic and miraculous thing about Maidan, which is very probably looks odd in frame of this ideology of efficiency and ideology of management of every action, every step. So and for me this is a trait of political, like the field of political, which is always based on this uncertainty of the political actions is always actions made in front of this kind of unpredictable results.
Once again pass the microphone to you. I would like to ask one more question. There was a question about possible help or support. We also switched a little bit to a political issue. So there is this. I know that it would be very difficult for you maybe to answer, but I would like to confront the so-called common or popular image of the possible political actions that I understand is rooted in the European or even transatlantic political ideas. From my understanding, the general idea of European Union and transatlantic connections towards the situation in Ukraine is based on two actions. One is economic pressure towards or against Russia in order to start supporting so-called separatists. And the second one is something I might consider in a simple way as preparation for possible war. Meaning that in Poland, for example, we are in general tension, but there should be some kind of militant approach towards this this issue, that we should have American troops placed in the region, or more American troops placed in the region. In general, the whole rhetoric is somehow centered around economic pressure in a practical sense, and the possible militant action against Russia in the future, if things don't go the proper direction or the expected direction. A question could be, what kind of actions the Western political, so-called Western political elites should introduce or perform in your understanding, or what kind of actions they should not. If we are speaking about the uncertainty, maybe the proper question would be, what kind of actions should not be performed by Western political elites?
Okay, it's as for me, the same story is still continuing from the times of Maidan, because first of all, apart from these sanctions, the European authorities and the EU countries should or even must follow their own law. And the law, the financial law concerning oligarchs and other big political names from Russia and Ukraine. What are the connections between, for example, Vienna and Kiev, and London and Moscow? Almost big part of London is just bought by Moscow oligarchs. So still, for Europe, it's the big challenge, because Maidan revealed actually not only the oligarchy in Ukraine, but it showed that oligarchy is also dominating the EU. So EU, it's the internal problem of the EU. The EU should deal with it, but actually, of course, it is somehow based on this capital. So they don't want to introduce some sanctions against these oligarchs, because they will lose money, their own money. So a lot of countries, I just not mentioning Slovakia and other like Bulgaria and so on, are totally dependent on the Russian criminal oligarchic money. But as for the actions for outside, I think it's also quite typical that Europe still is very modern, in the sense of modernism. It is reacting step by step, analyzing the situation. They should think first and then do something. Russia is very postmodern. It reacts fast way, creating some very strange ideas. For the Western countries, it's impossible just to understand how can you just put one thing on the table and then change it with the other one and say it was not true, and so on and so on. So this kind of bricolage, constant political and military bricolage, which is happening, and it has its own price, the lives of, in this case, Ukrainians. They already. That's why Europe is always out of time. It is not reacting in a proper time. It is always, remember when they introduced sanctions against Ukrainian ex-authorities. It was when Maidan was finished, in the beginning of March. If they introduced sanctions, for example, in December, I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't have so big number of the killed people. So it's also the question of time, which means that we are now the same. The price which Ukraine is paying for the decision making it's the price of the people's lives. That is what should be remembered first of all.
Okay. Any questions, comments, jakieś pytania, komentarze z Państwa strony? Proszę uprzejmie.
Yes, my question is about the European Union. What do you think about the, you said about the utopical of the people who were present and on Maidan and were fighting for joining to the European Union. Could you tell us more about this idea? This would be interesting. And what do you think about the official position of the European Union leaders? That some of them say that they were not ready to accept Ukraine into European Union shortly. That this is a huge task. This is lots of money which must be prepared to support the prepared and given to Ukraine, to support all the areas of economics, because in Poland, when signed an accession agreement with the European Union, it had said that within 10 years, Poland will have accession into European Union. This agreement was signed in 1994, and 10 years after, 2004, Poland was accepted to join the European Union. But this term was put into agreement with Poland, and there were stated conditions. Poland must work and introduce new legislation, which must be in accordance with the European one. And these pieces of legislation, these areas, were stated very precisely in this treaty, international treaty. So these conditions were very precise of accession. Why I'm talking about this? Recently I heard about the speech of one of the European high commissioners or bureaucratic people who said that they are not ready to accept the Ukraine into European Union in a short period of time, and they didn't think about this. They didn't consider this on the time of Maidan. It was in action or before, when this first agreement must be signed by Yanukovych. It was the critics of this agreement said that there was no such a precise term and conditions of accession. What can you say about this?
Actually, I think that Maidan and the European Union have one thing really in common, among all other relations, and this common thing is they both are very different, very heterogeneous. Like Maidan had kind of southern faces. EU doesn't equal EU. Yeah, there are many ways, many potentialities, many ways the EU can exist. Yeah, and the actual EU now, the European politics, is just one possibility of many, but it is presented as a constant one. And actually, I think that Maidan was a really great chance for the EU, for the European Union, to kind of rethink itself. Because actually, of course, one very surprising thing for many people in Europe was that some people somewhere in the East are still able to fly European flags and think of this symbol as a symbol of a better life. Because for so many people here, it's a symbol of not so good life. But The problem with this understanding was that if you actually talk to these people and if you follow the public debate about the European Union, it was actually, you could really see that people don't really speak the same language. That people speak about their own kind of illusions, because you could actually, like among the supporters of the association with the EU, you could hear the argument that EU is very good because they have low taxation, they have kind of more free market and so on. The state doesn't interfere in the free enterprise and so on. On the other hand, you could hear the voices that say, okay, but we should enter the EU because they have such good social standards, they have amazing kind of welfare states and so on. And these two views never conflicted. They kind of coexisted, and really, like no one argued on this issue, because the kind of real antagonism was about for or against the EU. But what actually the EU is was not the subject of debate. I think it could have been and should have been a subject of debate actually inside the EU, because Maidan was probably the turning point, not the turning point in the EU history.
Was there such a debate about EU? What is EU in Ukrainian press before Maidan, or in any way?
Yeah, of course. But to me, the greatest paradox of this debate was that these two views of supporters of the EU that I briefly presented, they never conflicted. They never were, okay, are we joining the EU because we have more free enterprise? Or are we joining the EU because they have like, better social standards? These two options could exist in one head, and you know, the contradiction was not really kind of physical.
Have you read such? You are from Poland, Ukraine.
Maybe it would be better to answer like one question, because now we can continue like in. There's no end.
Even two, because there were two questions.
Okay.
I wanted to add what was this idea of European Union for people. It was often not just some illusion or utopia, because people also have some knowledge, and but it was from the perspective that the alternative is to be with Russia, like in the between these two bad alternatives, the European Union is which one is better.
And well, actually, during the discussion, we mentioned already about this contradiction of this European utopia which existed on Maidan and was connected with certain values of justice, of maybe some human rights, and the real EU politics, which is not about the values but about money, actually. And so I mean that in the situation with Putin, probably I will also follow the bad taste and quote Zizek, because the European leaders, they know very well what they are doing, but they are still doing it because they don't want to lose some economical connections with Russia, some financial contacts. So, well, this probably was the contradiction.
You know, it is funny, we were joking actually with Slavomir that the EU took a position and Russia took Crimea. So, because, you know, it's also a mistake that people were fighting in Ukraine for the EU. Of course, it's not. The way, as I said, the way they used the EU flag was not the same. The European bureaucrats are using this flag, or you have this flag like at the every street or at some ministry. So it was a signifier which was redesigned by social forces. But the problem is that when the EU declares that it is not ready to include Ukraine, it only means, as you can clearly see, that Russia is ready. So that is a problem, that the EU today behaves like a resort. Don't bother us. We will rather keep a distance, because we can be concerned, we can be deeply concerned, we can be even shocked, but still it's better not, we are fed up with you. You are anyway out, you are a zone of transition. Of course we are dealing because it's pretty close to our borders, but still it's not inside. You know, the problem is that it also shows that the EU is doesn't exist as a political body, as a supranational body. Like, for example, the EU has no common energetic policy. Is it possible? It's very naive. Come on, when you are dealing especially with Russia. It has in a lot of aspects. And of course, on the other hand, this weakness is used by the Russian authorities, because Putin is constantly working on splitting the EU. You look at the last European elections. Yeah.
But my question was not about that, not about Putin. I was asking why Ukraine didn't build a legal society throughout 25 years. Why Ukraine wants to enter the European Union to build this legal society? Isn't it possible to build by your own health means the legal society when people could be in lawful way conduct business? Why you need European Union for that? Because, you know, I read in newspapers that Poles came to Italy to work in a farm, and Italians took their passports, put them into some holes, paid them nothing, and that was just slavery. And there's a police investigation about that. And this is European Union. Well, that was my question mostly.
Yeah, come on, I understand, but still it reminds me like the anecdote that, you know, when, I forgot the name of the princess, when the like poor people were protesting in front of the palace, she said why they are protesting. You know that. Because they have nothing to eat, they don't have bread. So why don't they eat cakes? I mean, of course there are a lot of contradictions why it is so hard and just to build a lawful and real society, but still it is the challenge for the EU, because Ukraine is the same as Poland somehow. Of course it's different, but if Poland is in the EU, why Ukraine is not? It's a political decision which lies behind. It's not some natural status quo. It was decided like that. And what I meant that the EU is not ready for that, because it is not existing as one entity from a lot of points of view. Look what is happening now in Europe, meaning the new rise of the far right. Yeah. We are observing like the new fascist international in Europe, which is totally, by the way, supported by the Russian authorities. Almost all of the right-wing parties in Europe were supporting illegal referendums in Crimea. They were like so-called observers of that referendum. It's not by occasion. So it's a very complicated, like multi-dimensional structure, which is not just this kind of populist approach that why don't you do that, why don't you do that. So it demands a long process, which has a lot of the players on the table.
I want to add about you said that why Ukrainian society don't build their own good society. But Maidan, it was maybe the first step, or not first, to do that, because the corruption and the criminal power which was in Ukraine, it was not possible to build so good society, and the people stand up against that.
Propose to ask the two final questions.
Okay, I'll try. I would like to ask you a little bit more about the narrative, the present narrative in your country. I don't know much, to be honest, about a Ukrainian nation, although I was born in this town near the border, but still I don't know much. And you said about the change, you were telling us about the narrative of the Maidan, and you said one thing, that the attitude changed during this thing, the attitude of people. That is, first, people, this is how I understood it, people experience this being together and experience that people are important, that every life is important. But then I understood it changed, and you said also that every death was perceived as a disaster, as a defeat. And you said that this changed later, that people, I don't know, forgot about this, and started thinking more about fighting, not fighting for, but fighting against. And now my question is, how is it now? Because you are from Ukraine, and so you can tell us something more. How is it now? I know you are not, you cannot tell for the whole of the nation, but I'm asking you, how do you feel? What is the narrative of the nation now, and also what is the narrative of attitude people should take? Yes, is it how is it narrated? I don't know, by television, by the press. Is it actually this attitude that we are just fighting, and no matter, people do not longer count, or is it? Or do you still somehow try to find a way to preserve this human factor in all of this? I don't know if I'm clear. Yeah? So, please.
It's changed because the war started. And you know, the war, the situation of war, it's a situation where every day a lot of people die. Because the real people die, and we saw their faces in the pictures around the stage of Maidan and so on. And but now in the Ukrainian media we hear from the power that like such patriotic discourse that we have to help soldiers. It's all about war, that we can fight for our country, and of course it's other situation. And,
if I understand you correctly, about the information, the value of the human life. Oksana talked in her presentation about the different volunteer structures which emerged during the Maidan, for example. This, when people helped in the hospitals, helped to transport injured people from hospitals to homes, collected money for medicines, and so on. And all of these structures, for example, continue to exist. And now they are like helping Ukrainian army, so people this initiative during the Maidan now work to support Ukrainian army and to secure people who go to war. So all these initiatives like Maidan SOS now is response to Donbass, no, East SOS, and people continue to collect money to buy these ballots for soldiers to buy the medicines and so on. So, when I'm trying to express that people still feel this I mean, it exists this solidarity, and you know, people, like the Ukrainian army is like a people's army in some point, because it exists in most major part for people's money and with people's support and so on. So I think this experience is developing now.
Last question.
But there were two. So please be short. So we can have two, but please.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to Warsaw. When I saw the film, I remembered all the evenings when I was particularly on and TV, and I imagined myself on the Maidan. Of course, I experienced that the third Maidan might happen in winter. And do you know anything about that? And it's supposed to be organized by pro-Russian forces, not Ukrainians, but those people who want to mess in Ukraine. Yes. Oh, and please take care, and I wish you all the best.
Before you answer, maybe we could collect the final question.
Thank you for coming. The key issue, key message laboratory, the future for Europe, for the United States, city, social solidarity, a new form of organized community. But the problem is, Europe is not interested in this message. Europe is like the political elites looking for peace. Russians, for the 80%, protect the Putin's politics. For who are you addressed this message? It's my question.
So, first question regarding the possible preparations for the first Maidan. If you could share any useful.
Regarding your question, I can quote the statement by the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yeltsin, who recently said that each and every person who is going to protest this autumn against the social cuts and different unpopular measures that are imposed by the IMF initiatives and so on, all of these people are agents of Moscow. They were deliberately planted in Ukraine years ago, so please, if you are a conscious citizen, please don't join any kind of protest, because this is, if you don't like what is going on, if you don't like the government, you are the Moscow agent. So I think that the biggest trouble actually that could be the outcome of this war, maybe no, except the total kind of defeat. The biggest trouble would be that Ukraine will actually could really soon remind us of Russia. I mean, Ukraine could slowly, by way of resisting Russia, kind of absorb absorb the policies, the attitudes, and so on that kind of characterize the Putinist regime. And if you look at the origins of the regime of Putin, it was actually also it was created owing to the so-called counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya. So the biggest danger in our part of the war itself is that the consequence would be that war in Donbass could do to Ukraine exactly what war in Chechnya did to Russia, which is not really a democratic thing.
But war is not democracy.
I wanted to say just a small thing that about preparing for the future, and because of the danger of war, it's like in our everyday life, and a lot of people, for example, want to have a Schengen visa, and for children and for all people, and now it's really hard to take it in Ukraine. For example, in Polish visa center, during last half year, it's not possible to do that. So we came here just because of connection, of contact, direct contact from Krytyka Polityczna to Polish embassy, and this is a problem. But people want to prepare this way also.
Just does it force the degree of power, state government in Russian society? It's like the expression of Ukraine, like, you know, mirror Russia in the constitution.
No, I mean, I'm not making any direct parallels, but if you look at some details, like for example, presidential elections, if you remember what happened in the elections in Russia in 2000, when a person who was completely unknown to anybody a year ago suddenly wins in the first round of elections with a rating of, I don't know, 60% or something, which is an unprecedented level of support. So this kind of parallel, I think, is completely justified. Our current president was also, a year ago, was absolutely, there was right.
Yeah, thank you for your question about the addressee of the Ukrainian message. Actually, when I'm trying to think about some concrete stuff which can be behind our message, and also who is the receiver, I would tell that like every emancipative political message, it is directed to some universal subjectivity, which is based on some shared common experience. There is a famous Latin expression which afterwards started to mean a little bit different thing. I mean sensus communis. Now it means like common sense, like ordinary average of understanding the world. But in ancient Rome, it meant that we have the same horizon, that we have the same or common understanding, and we share some experience, and it doesn't matter to whom we belong, but we as the citizens of some community, like some common, can share the same political background. So I would answer that this message, the Ukrainian message, and Maidan is speaking to all those who share the notions of democracy, freedom, and equality, not just as ideas from theory, but who understands these ideas as some everyday basic needs which are implemented on an everyday level and which demand hard political work. Yeah, what Lesia was mentioning about political labor. It's not only the Ukrainian answer. Every democratic idea demands hard political jobs, political work. But anyway, I am constantly repeating that as for now, the West, I understand that Europe, as you said, is not interested in this message. Okay, it can play this game, but anyway, it is postponing of the problem. I can say for sure that nobody can find, maybe except some really weird politicians, but nobody can find common background with today's Russian authorities. It is just impossible, like a priori, because you should first include some Russian exclusiveness they present, or their way to behave, and so they demand that you should include and accept that we are special, exclusive, and it's an a priori for the further discussion. Anyway, what I'm thinking and what is really important now, I don't know what will happen in the future. I'm not like making prognosis or some forecasts, but still, I already said it a couple of times, I am absolutely sure that in 20 or 30 years, there will be another that will state that today's attitude and perception from the West, from Ukraine, of the Russian authorities, of Putin, is totally naive and a historical mistake. I can say it for 200% sure.
It seems to me that your question applies somehow asymmetry, because when you're talking about the message of Maidan to the Europe who are not interested, so when you're speaking about Maidan, you're speaking about, first of all, the practice of the people, of Ukrainian people, and then you are talking about Europe. It seems to me that you this is the one who addressed.
What was the reaction?
We are here.
You're still waiting.
Observed it.
No, it isn't. Probably, the process.
So the question is, for who are you addressed this message?
So, my answer is this message is addressed not to European elites, but to European people. But, the process, I cannot answer how this message should be read and how it would be, what would be reaction. I'm just saying to whom is this addressed.
We continue.
Thank you very much. I hope that following Oleksij's appeal, thanks to this encounter, we had an opportunity to understand a little bit better what is happening in Ukraine. But I would like to thank our guests for the contribution and sharing their experiences and knowledge. But I also would like to say something about our presence here, in a way referring to what you have just mentioned. We knew that our Ukrainian friends would be in Poland, and it's a very good opportunity to organize such an encounter. On the other hand, we were absolutely aware that the beginning of September might be at least unfortunate for such a meeting, and we really expect that all of us were ready for just a small number of very dedicated, devoted, and interested people to come and to talk with us. And I personally was very surprised how many of you came. And for me, this act of practical interest and solidarity with what is happening in Ukraine might also be an answer to what you said. Because I think that I believe that through this action we can see that the people of Europe do hear the message. I don't know whether we perceive and understand the message, but I believe that at least we do. Thank you very much.
I also wanted to thank to Slavek Blik, who provided an excellent translation, I'm pretty sure, but he doesn't hear me now. Thank you, Slavek.